I'm pleased to announce members of my science and technology team. Dr. John Holdren has agreed to serve as Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy.
You will see that the world has turned out exactly as they planned. This can't be coincidence. I'm Alan Watts, and I'm an author and researcher into geopolitics, really, and history. I follow where the world has been, the techniques that were used to bring them to those stages, and I apply them to where we are today and how the future is planned. I've researched so many books. I've got a library of my own. I like paperback books, or at least hardback books, because they're permanent records of the past. If you can't understand the past, you understand the present or the future. I've also been in the music business, heavily involved for years, and I saw how culture creation works from the top, and how generations were swayed into new fashions, new ideas. And in a post-industrial era, these big boys have decided, and their masters too, that we are simply superfluous and they no longer need us.
Holdren is anti-American in this deep way. He is a pessimist culturally and historically. He calls himself a neo-Malthusianism. Now, the heart of his outlook is what he calls, well, he says that population is the root of all human problems. Now again, the note of genocide, the idea that whole countries should be consigned to doom, puts Holdren in a league which is far beyond Hitler in terms of the number of victims that these policies would result in.
From deep within the dunes of Africa's Namib Desert, a terrible secret is beginning to emerge. These are the remains of victims of the world's first death camp. A place where thousands of Africans were exterminated by the German army 30 years before the Nazis came to power. These remains have lain here forgotten for over 100 years. But this terrible place is not unique. Scattered across the world are the sites of the massacres and genocides of imperialism, where millions died in an aspect of colonial history that Europe often chooses to forget. These people were victims of the truth that lies behind the myth of the white man's burden. Throughout the 19th century, European scientists, writers, and philosophers developed ideas to justify the mass killings of the Age of Empire. These same theories went on to inspire some of the horrors and the savagery that would consume Europe in the 20th century.
Eugenics originated in England with the work of Francis Galton. He studied traits and family lines and began the nature versus nurture debate. He focused on twins to answer the question of what was more powerful, heredity or environment. He proposed positive eugenics, encouraging the reproduction of eminent men and their families, whose accomplishments he had tied to the progress of civilization. He cautioned against drawing premature and harmful conclusions from his work, but like his cousin, Charles Darwin, his work was used as justification for some of the greatest crimes in history. Negative eugenics is the application of means to discourage the breeding of the unfit, including anti-race mixing marriage laws, segregation, sterilization, and euthanasia. Eugenics is not a true science, and though it is dressed up in mathematics to give it legitimacy, it has much more in common with the quack science of phrenology. Phrenology was the study of the size and shape of the human head to determine intelligence and character. The industrial age had thrown millions of people off the farm and into the city to work in low-paying factory jobs. The sheer scale of the problems of mental illness, alcoholism, and crime seemed overwhelming. Added to this, millions of Eastern Europeans and Italians came to America and made the native population uneasy. They were viewed as bad stock compared to the more Nordic types that had made up earlier waves of immigration from Western Europe. Suggestions for solving these problems took the form of negative eugenics. However, the eugenics movement's leaders were smart enough to realize that America was not prepared for euthanasia. The eugenics movement took shape in America with the founding of the Eugenics Recording Office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in 1910 by Charles Davenport, with money from the Carnegie Institution. The ERO compiled millions of files on ordinary Americans. The adherents of eugenics included some of the most influential doctors and scientists of the era, including Alexander Graham Bell, Luther Burbank, W.M. Kellogg, David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford University, William Welch of Johns Hopkins University. Professors at Harvard, Columbia, Yale, and other universities taught 375 courses on eugenics. The hypothesis that mental illness, crime, and poverty were inherited factors and could be cured through negative eugenics had been by the 1920s accepted by American society as fact. Contests for fitter families were common at state fairs, and eugenics publications and ideas were widespread. This could not have been possible without the hard work of many eminent men and the application of large amounts of money. The great fortunes of the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, Harriman family, Ford Foundation, and others funded the ERO, the American Eugenics Society, the American Eugenics Party, and others. The American eugenics movement actively encouraged foreign countries to participate, concentrating most heavily on Germany. The opening address of the Second International Congress of Eugenics in 1921 was repeated in German. Only 3,000 people had been forcibly sterilized by the time the famous case of Buck v. Bell reached the Supreme Court. Carrie Buck was a 17-year-old girl who had become pregnant out of wedlock in 1920s Virginia. She was ostracized by her community, and her baby, Vivian Buck, was reported to the ERO as appearing not normal. Carrie and her mother's files were examined. Both had previously been classified as morons, and court proceedings were begun to have Carrie forcibly sterilized without examination. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered the famous verdict of the court in 1927. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit for continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This decision validated Virginia's Eugenical Sterilization Act and set in motion the forced sterilization of 60,000 American citizens. Eventually, similar laws were passed in 33 other states. Carrie Buck was not a promiscuous and disruptive moronic slut as she had been portrayed at trial by the testimony of her school superintendent. She had in fact been raped by her foster family's son. She had been on the honor roll. Her forcible sterilization was a result of lies, incorrect diagnosis, In a plot to pass the Virginia law, a review of the case uncovered a conspiracy between Carey's defense lawyer and the colony of Virginia to ensure the constitutionality of the Virginia law. The state was trying to save money by sterilizing the growing population in its mental health facilities. The greatest impact of Buck v. Bell was in Germany. In 1933, the Nazi government adopted the Prevention of Hereditarily Ill Offspring Act, which was based on Buck v. Bell, and led to the forced sterilization of 375,000 people and the banning of marriage and sexual relations between Germans and Jews. The Rockefeller Foundation funded the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, including the work of Ernst Rudin, a leading psychiatrist who became an architect and prime director of the murderous medical experimentation programs conducted on thousands of Jews, Gypsies, and others. American money also endowed the work of Ottmar Verschuer, who headed the Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. He wrote in his eugenics journal that Germany's war would yield a total solution to the German problem. Verschuer had a longtime assistant. His name was Joseph Mengele. On May 30th, 1943, Mengele arrived at Auschwitz. Verschuer notified the German Research Society. My assistant, Dr. Joseph Mengele, MD, PhD, joined me in this branch of research. He is presently employed as captain and camp physician in the Auschwitz concentration camp. Anthropological testing of the most diverse racial groups in this concentration camp is being carried out with the permission of SS Reichsfuhrer Himmler. Mengele began searching the boxcar arrivals for twins. When he found them, he performed beastly experiments, scrupulously wrote up the reports, and sent paperwork back to Verschuer's institute for evaluation. Often cadavers, eyes, and other body parts were dispatched to Berlin's eugenic institutes. Several doctors who had been sent to Auschwitz for aiding Jews worked as his assistants and described him thus. His experiments and observations were carried out in an abnormal fashion. When he made transfusions, he purposely used incorrect blood types. He would inject substances and then ignore the results. He did what he pleased and conducted his experiments like a mad amateur. He was not a savant. He had the mania of a collector. The toll of eugenics laws would fall heavily on non-Jewish Germans as well. The chronology of events is instructive. First, patients in German mental facilities were sterilized. Then it was decided to gas them. Carbon monoxide gas was used in the beginning, but was discarded in favor of Zyklon B gas for reasons of economy and effectiveness. Next, all the residents of the old age homes in Germany were either starved, given lethal injection, or gassed and then cremated. Finally, German citizens who had physical disabilities, many quite mild or correctable, were euthanized. Between 50 and 100,000 German citizens were eventually killed. The program was referred to as a mercy death. However, nothing could be farther from the truth. Witnesses said that the floor, walls, and even ceiling of the gas chamber were stained with blood, vomit, urine, and feces. At the center of the room would be an enormous pile of bodies in the general shape of a pyramid as people climbed to the top of each other to reach the last remaining breathable air near the ceiling. The American eugenics movement leaders went underground and changed the name of their organizations. The lifelong friendships between people like Verschuer and the leading members of the American eugenics movement continued even after the Holocaust. He and many others were never punished and remained influential men in society. Their portraits hang in many major universities, both in Germany and America. The names of their victims are mostly lost to history. They included the powerless people who couldn't fight back. Carrie Buck's daughter died at the age of 8 due to an illness. In her short career, she had made the honor roll.
The 19th century was to end with the worst crimes of empire, but it began with a great moment of optimism. In the 1830s, in the great plantations of the Caribbean, Britain prepared to become the first nation to end slavery. 750,000 slaves across the Caribbean were about to be freed. And as Britain basked in her sense of national benevolence, it was presumed that the grateful slaves would transform themselves into a hard-working and Christian peasantry. The battle against slavery had been led from the pulpit by an alliance of Christian abolitionists and missionaries. They had fought the campaign from their churches and meeting halls. In the 1830s, it was their views that dominated the national debate on race.
When slavery was finally abolished, there would have been an enormous sense of elation and achievement on the part of the abolitionists. Don't forget, this was a 50-year campaign from 1787 onwards, involving hundreds of thousands of ordinary British people, petitions, etc. So that when slavery was abolished, the abolitionists had won a sense of triumph. I think they also felt that that question, am I not a man and a brother, was answered.
The abolitionist response to that great question was that although men and brothers, black people were lesser men and lesser brothers.
I think in that moment, the dominant perspective is of a hierarchical racial order, but one in which it's a question of culture and civilization. They certainly do not think that black people are equal to them at this time. They think maybe at some time in the future they will be equal.
The mission to raise up the black and brown peoples of the world to the supposedly superior level of white Englishmen was not to be confined to the former slaves. This was to be the great task that would justify the expansion of the British Empire.
The abolitionists satisfied one aspect of their tutelage and governance of black people, in that they fought and won for the freedom of black people. The next step was to send your stormtroopers, your missionaries, into Africa and the Caribbean to finish off the job, as it were. You know, these are heathens who have to be brought into the fold of Christianity. That notion of giving civilized values and modes of behavior to other peoples, that's the ideology that underpinned the empire.
In the empire that the missionaries and abolitionists set out to create, indigenous peoples would see their cultures destroyed and their religions eradicated. And yet all this seems almost benign when compared with the grim reality of what imperialism became. Because during the 19th century, their dream was gradually overwhelmed by another vision. One that claimed that the dark races could not be civilized and should instead be exterminated.
I've been following the histories of what's now called the New World Order for many, many years. And I try to go into the books written by the big players, the technocrats themselves, those famous people like the Kissingers, the Brzezinskis and so on, the Huxleys, the Lord Bertrand Russells, who all worked for the same organizations. And I came to the conclusion, really, there was only one big organization with many subcategories. These boys tend to publish the world that they saw coming into view, and they wrote it in their own hand, basically. They told us where they were taking the world. And when you start studying these things about the age of 14, 15, or even younger, and reading their books, and you live long enough, you will see that the world has turned out exactly as they planned. This can't be coincidence. And who can really write up a wish list and make it happen globally, unless there is an organization very, very powerful, probably the only organization really on the planet, an organization that can fund all sides, all oppositions, and using the synthesis of conflicting parties, they can literally make the world come into view as they planned.
Under chemical and biological attack, the scientific dictatorship sought to not only overthrow nation states, but to destroy the family and the human species itself. All of us are under attack. The global technocrats launched their assaults through covert means, through our water and food supplies, as well as household items, food packaging, prescription and over-the-counter drugs. All of these systems used to deliver their covert Trojan horse payloads of control. If we are unsuccessful in stopping these technocratic madmen, humanity as we know it is a thing of the past. The report that you are about to see documents this horrific fact in detail. What you do with the information is up to you. You have been warned. The information that you are about to see and hear is some of the most important info that you will ever witness in your life. I can say that unequivocally. And I am begging you, for the sake of you and your family and for our human family, to please take notes, to check the different documents and news articles that we're going to show you here today, and prove to yourself that we're telling you the truth. In fact, we're only scratching the surface. There is a private global corporate government now operating in the open that is based on the quack science of eugenics. And to put that in a pop culture context, or something the general public will understand, Hitler was a eugenicist. And he got his ideas from scientists in England and the United States. Now, the robber barons like the Rockefellers that funded Hitler early on in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute still control this nation and much of the world today. And the entire development of modern sciences through large tax-free foundations and government funding and DARPA that President Eisenhower warned us about has been in the direction of basically creating an artificial habitat, an artificial system where the scientific dictators, or the technocrats as they call themselves, play God over us and manipulate us. They see us as lab rats, as guinea pigs. Now, in the last decade, I've talked a lot about eugenics, really for more than 16 years on air, but intensely for 10 years or more. And in the different documents that we're going to show you here, we found the UN documents, the Planned Parenthood documents, the World Population Organization documents, where they openly discussed breaking up the family, getting rid of the, quote, arcane institution so they could have their international collectivist system, shutting down all competition against the ultra-rich. That is the system that we face as a society. And I'm going to go over some of those documents. But up front, I want to just say this. The system is scared to death of this information. 3 years ago, they had a bunch of different George Soros-affiliated and Democratic Party-affiliated groups come out against me and really simplify the straw man that they'd built and go after me by saying, Alex Jones says the government is putting chemicals in your food and water to make you gay. What I had actually said was, bisphenol A alone, that's in thousands of plastic products, printer ink, you name it, is lowering male fertility, is a estrogen mimicker, and is feminizing boys and men and hyper-feminizing women, and has been linked in major studies to breast cancer and other cancers. It is devastating our society. And these hormonal disruptors are actually running off into the lakes, streams, and rivers and confusing the sexual reproduction of nutria rats, rodents, fish, turtles, you name it. This is a toxic waste, and it is added to our water, it is added to our food, it is added through the plastics that are in almost everything to our daily lives to reduce our fertility. Now, I want to show you first this document. This is from Planned Parenthood to the president of the Population Council that was tied in with the United Nations. And in it, they break down in 1969 plans to lower population and destroy the family. A, postpone or avoid marriage. B, alter image of ideal family size. Demonize having more than one child. Compulsory education of children. They mean brainwashing. Now listen to this one. Encourage increased homosexuality. Here's another one. Educate for family limitation. Fertility control agents in water supply. And the current White House science czar, John P. Holdren, is on record in multiple books calling for this as well. And I got news for you. It's going on now. You are being forcibly drugged with toxic chemicals. Hundreds of them are added to the water supply, including radioactive isotopes, not just sodium fluoride that gives you a 7-fold increase in cancer. They have gone absolutely ape over the fact that I'm talking about this, because it hits at the core of how these scientists are playing God, okay? This is not saying that people in the Roman times, some of them weren't gay or whatever. This is not about a moral issue. This is about to reduce population, giving men estrogen mimickers so that they're not attracted to women and so they are less fertile or infertile. But on the other side, it's making girls go into puberty at 9, 10 years old. Many of them now at 5. I've seen some articles as young as 3. This is all over the Western world. The United States has the highest cancer rates, especially in women and breast cancer. It basically accelerates the aging process to simplify it. It does a bunch of other horrible things as well. It causes deformities in utero, causes more abortions, women to have miscarriages, and that's what this document gets into. It says compulsory abortion for out-of-wedlock pregnancies, compulsory sterilization of all who have had 2 children. What do you see in China? Our government went over there in the 70s, made a deal with the U.S. government and the UN to industrialize China and finance them if they do this. And now I see articles where they have forced abortions, where they're arresting people or taking their property if they have more children than the state says they can have. China is the model of the world. Break out of this matrix. Realize that you live in a controlled society and an artificially constructed civilization that is designed to dehumanize you and strip you of what it is to be a human, taking over our very reproductive process, chemically altering men and women at an early age and even in utero. And what happens when I point this out? How does the establishment, the mainstream media, these corporate dinosaur mercenaries of propaganda, these prostitutes, how do they respond? Same way they've done for years. Last week, there were articles in CBS News, ABC News, you name it, attacking myself and Ron Paul, saying Ron Paul goes on Alex Jones's show, and Alex Jones says the government's putting chemicals in your food and water to make you gay. You see, they know people are reading that, and so they take all this research and they just turn it into, Alex says they want to make you gay, and look, Ron Paul goes on their show. When what I've really shown here is this is being done to reduce fertility, to increase cancer, and to destroy our normal gender roles. You're taking people's choices to have children away. You're taking people's choices to choose their sexual preference away. You know, they spin it and say you're born this way, and certainly there's different variants of it. Some of it is natural, but they're artificially adding chemicals that are making rats be confused about their gender, male and female. You're being chemically altered. Here are the documents. Here's the White House science czar calling for adding stuff to the water, and their answer is, oh, Alex doesn't like gay people. That has nothing to do with this. This is about science and being manipulated by a technocracy that's playing God. The Centers for Disease Control has come out after public pressure and after scientific pressure and admitted that what's in the printer ink and the receipt ink and on the money and in thousands of products, TV dinners, you name it, toilet paper, that people are touching is an estrogen mimicker and was chosen out of thousands of different varieties to be a chemical in the environment to reduce fertility and to basically turn men into servile creatures. The globalists just want to subdue the population so they can engage in chemical and biological warfare against us. our water, our food, it's all being manipulated. And it's admitted now that the majority of water supplies in the U.S. have high levels of Prozac, high levels of female hormones, high levels of hundreds and hundreds of other chemicals that are, quote, runoff. The problem is, I've seen the major studies. In some cases, this stuff is 200, 300, 400 times higher than it could be from sewage runoff. It's being added to the water. There's a reason the American people and the people of Western Europe will put up with such incredible tyranny. It's because we've been chemically and biologically manipulated. And you find out what it's doing to people. It is mind-boggling. This is a holocaust that's going on. This is an attack on the human species itself, so these eugenicists can bring in their world government. Look at this headline. Bisphenol A now linked to male infertility and gender confusion. Here's another one. Sperm counts continue to plummet, say researchers connected to bisphenol A. Greenpeace finds toxic chemicals in branded clothing. Canned food may expose people to BPA, the little juice box liners. Canada declares BPA toxic, sets stage for more bans. FDA faulted for stance on chemicals in plastics. Here's the good news. A decade ago, when you talked about bisphenol A and other issues similar to it, you were laughed at. That isn't happening now. The Canadian government, different European governments have moved in the last 4 years to have it removed by law. Here in the United States, retailers have come out and advertised that they're bisphenol A free, but the establishment and the eugenicists have struck back. They're now having it added to literally thousands of different products, as I mentioned earlier, even toilet paper, so that it's incredibly hard to avoid this stuff. These nasty little globalist control freaks count on you being lazy, count on you being trusting. They count on you not researching and finding out the full horror of what they're involved in. This is a total takeover of the biosphere of our planet, just like Monsanto's coming out with seeds, the Terminator seeds that don't reproduce. You've got to go to them each time. There's a new report out, International Journal of Biomedical Sciences, very prestigious. Monsanto GMO corn linked to organ failure. When you read deeper in the study, it's causing massive infertility in all mammal species, and within 3 generations, near total infertility in guinea pigs, rats. There are no human studies. Do you understand? We're already a generation and a half or so into this, and we see fertility plummeting. Within 3 generations in all mammal species they tested in, 99% infertility and incredible deformities. And now, because there's such incredible infertility, the globalists are coming out with the infertility treatments, which they sell at incredible cost to the public. They add things to the water, add things to the food, add things to the packaging chain by design through these global combines, through these agreements, and then when you're sterile, they come back and for millions of dollars, you go to them for these expensive genetic treatments so you can have children, but they're now designer. And the companies can build whatever Trojan horses they want into the back end. And then they will have the high-tech treatments that are able to unlock our genetic code and allow us to reproduce again. Once the world government's in place, in all their own UN and Club of Rome documents, they're talking about an 80% world population reduction. That's what their world government is about. That's why the big mega banks that run this system want to destroy the world economy so that everybody is dependent on government. They don't want you to be self-sufficient. They want you to be dumbed down and controlled. But if you're aware of the chemical and biological cocktails that are assaulting you, we can fight our way out of this by making choices that limit the amount of exposure we have to this form of warfare. There's a reason all these diseases are increasing, because we are being slow killed. We are being soft killed. We are being murdered by a cocktail of poisons. This is the ultimate revolution. This is the human revolution against a technocratic, psychopathic, control freak elite who are playing God. Warn everyone you know about bisphenol A. It's in almost everything. Clothes, printer ink, packaging. It's everywhere. And retail workers and factory workers that are around this are being devastated by it. Let's reclaim our humanity together. Don't let them use little cliches about, oh, we're bashing gay people, or oh, we're conspiracy theorists. When these criminals attack us with propaganda, we need to shove the facts right back in their face and say, we see you, we know what you're doing, we've got the facts, and we're not laying down and taking it anymore. Humanity is awakening to the crimes that you, the eugenicists, have been committing against us, and you will be brought to justice. Now, the rest is up to you. Get this information out to everyone you know. The ball is in your court. The information you've seen is only a tiny fraction of the accumulated research that Infowars.com has amassed. It's now up to you to do your own research, to fully awaken, and then begin the task of awakening others. Our species is strong, and we can defeat this tiny group of psychopaths attempting to set themselves up as God.
Today, I'm pleased to announce members of my science and technology team. Dr. John Holdren has agreed to serve as Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy.
John P. Holdren is the resident science czar of the Obama White House. He's the head of the White House Council on Science and Technology, key advisor operating out of the new Executive Office building in Washington, D.C. This man is a Malthusian fanatic. He's a follower of Bentham and Malthus and Darwin. In other words, the main philosophers of the British Empire in the 19th century and the fountainhead of reactionary and anti-human ideology in that time frame. He's a radical environmentalist, an ecological fanatic, a green kook, a wacko, except that it's also very sinister because the implications of his belief structure and his world outlook are genocide. He is, in particular, an enemy of the traditional American point of view on the world. Holdren polemicizes in his books against people he calls the cornucopians, people who think that the bounty of nature and of production is unlimited. He says that's not true. There are limits to growth, and we have to live within those limits. He polemicizes against growthsmanship, that you can grow your way out of a crisis. According to Holdren, that door has been permanently closed on all of us. And in particular, he says he hates the moonshot mentality of the average American, and that is to say, with the right kind of national mobilization, technology, and political will, you can do just about anything, including putting a man on the moon or putting other people out into space. So Holdren is anti-American in this deep way. He is a pessimist culturally and historically. He calls himself a neo-Malthusianism. Now, the heart of his outlook is what he calls, he says that population is the root of all human problems. In other words, people pollute. Humanity is a cancer on the face of the earth. The one big problem in the ecosystem is the role of humankind. And of course, in reality, the existing ecosystem could not survive without the constant contributions of human production. It's very easy to show that. Holdren started off in the 1970s with Paul Ehrlich, who was a charlatan and an obscurantist and a crackpot who wrote the book The Population Bomb. Ehrlich was convinced that world population was growing out of control and that this was going to lead to a breakdown of human civilization sometime in the late 20th century. And it goes together with the campaign of the limits of growth, the Club of Rome, Aurelio Peccei, and the rest of these people. This is kind of the intellectual milieu that Holdren comes out of. Now, there was no population bomb. It's just not true. It never happened. Population in Europe is falling. If you just look at the self-renewal of these populations. Same thing in Japan, same thing in Russia. They've all got a demographic problem which has nothing to do with overpopulation. It has to do with shrinking population. China has demographic problems that were caused by going along with this two-child per family policy. The U.S. would be experiencing demographic decline if it weren't for the flow of immigrants into the country. So there never was a population bomb. But Holdren does not revise or change his pseudoscientific outlook because of this. Population is the problem. Now, he looks around the world, writing in the early 1970s in one of his textbooks, and he says, some countries have so much population that they ought to be triaged. We should cut them off, give them no more food aid, no more credit, no more help of any kind. Well, what are the countries? He says India is probably on the list. India, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, and Holdren says cast them into the outer darkness. Then Bangladesh, with a couple of 100 million people, Holdren says for sure Bangladesh has got to be triaged. Give them nothing. Now again, the note of genocide. The idea that whole countries should be consigned to doom puts Holdren in a league which is far beyond Hitler in terms of the number of victims that these policies would result in. He hates science and technology. He wants to limit science and technology. He regards them as a threat to what he thinks of as the social order, and also to the crackpot views of charlatans and fakers like himself. He says he wants to create a science court that would decide which inventions could be put into practice and which would have to be banned. This is unbelievable. This would essentially strangle the source of human progress and consign us all into a stagnation and ruin which would never end. Holdren believes that there's a world optimum population, or carrying capacity. Now, the idea of carrying capacity comes from the writings of a Venetian kook by the name of Gianmaria Ortes, O-R-T-E-S, writing in 1790 or thereabouts. Ortes said that the limit of the world population was 3 billion people, and that if you went beyond that, you'd have famine and starvation and death, and it would always tend back to 3 billion people. Now, Holdren is even worse. He's more genocidal than Gianmaria Ortes. He's more genocidal than Malthus, who followed in the footsteps of Ortes. Holdren says that the optimum world population is 1 billion. Now let's pause. At the time Holdren wrote that, the world population was already 4 billion. Today, if you say the optimum population is 1 billion, it would mean that more than 5 billion would have to go. And again, these are orders of magnitude that Hitler, Stalin, and Mao never dreamed of. Only in the mind of fanatics like Holdren do we get genocide of these proportions. Holdren says that the big task of policy, and here the third world and developing countries should take note, he says the main political problem facing the world is not world economic development, but stopping world economic development. He's very worried that countries like China and India and others, Latin America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, that they're going to try to imitate the development of the US, Europe, and Japan. And Holdren says that would be catastrophic. What we need is to stop third world development. We've got to convince the third world not to do that, and we've got to institute de-development worldwide. In other words, turn back the clock of history, roll back progress, and go back to what amounts to pre-industrial civilization. Well, pre-industrial civilization is a lifespan of 30 to 35 years, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes put it. So that's what Holdren wants for you and your family. In order to enforce this, he talks about a supranational monstrosity that he calls a planetary regime. This means a world empire, a supranational, one-world government that would attempt to control all details of human life. Would start with what he calls the global commons. That is to say, anything that impacts the air, the soil, and the oceans would become the subject of international, supranational intervention. It would be like the IMF on steroids. Instead of just economic life, it would extend to everything. Again, the temperature in your living room, the kind of car you have, the amount you get to eat, whether you have a pet. I mean, minimal details about your everyday life. For individual countries such as the US, Holdren recommends a population law which would fix the outer limits of the acceptable population. And again, what happens if you're surplus? What happens if you are declared a useful leader? He doesn't say that so explicitly, but it's clear that you wouldn't fare very well. So one of the features of a population law, in Holdren's point of view, is to regulate the size of the family. And this is what, of course, China did in the post-Mao period, the two-child per family policy. So the hand of the totalitarian state intervenes in the most intimate decisions of the family, and the realm of individual responsibility pretty much ceases to exist. Now, Holdren is willing to do just about anything to, first of all, slow the rate of population increase. That's his first goal. Secondly, to bring population into stasis or equilibrium, zero growth, but then to turn it back and have a decreasing, diminishing world population. The Chinese experience is if you do that, you're flirting with economic collapse. But Holdren doesn't care about that. He's, of course, a fanatic. So what is he willing to do? He talks about all kinds of forced sterilization, that you can have surgical interventions on males. In India, he says, there was a policy of obligatory vasectomy once you had 2 children in the family if you were a government employee. He says that's something we could think about imitating. Compulsory abortion. Think about that. That would be something that was flirted with in post-Maoist China. He wants to have licenses for birth. In other words, a woman is not allowed to give birth unless she's purchased a marketable birth license. And of course, what happens if Goldman Sachs comes in and, because women are going to want those, drives up the price 100 times so that nobody can afford a birth permit? And what happens to people that are born illegitimately, meaning without a birth permit? He wants to have things that have been done in the meantime. Norplant, I think, is an example. Subcutaneous chemical devices that are put into the flesh of women to prevent them from conceiving. So forced sterilization, compulsory abortion, forced vasectomy, birth licenses, subcutaneous implants, all kinds of compulsory, obligatory methods. In terms of forced sterilizations, he says you could do this by putting chemicals in food and water, but he thinks that these other methods would be more effective. He also has other methods of persuasion, which are really coercion, that if you have more than 2 kids in the family, there's no more free public education for you. The 3rd kid has to pay to go to the public school. If you're living in public housing, which is the case in some countries, the 3rd kid gets you kicked out of the public housing and you become homeless. He's also in favor of violating the family by seizing babies. He says that if it's a teenager or a minor who has had an illegitimate child and there's no husband in the picture, then the government should come in and seize that child and have a policy of forced adoption to take care of that illegitimate child. You can see that Holdren is a collectivist. He is not a collectivist of the Marxist type, however. I would call him a collectivist in the tradition of Rousseau for 2 reasons. Remember, there are 2 Rousseaus. One is the Rousseau who says that the noble savage is the goal of human life. In other words, the more primitive you are, the less civilization you have, the better you are. Just if you think about that, Rousseau on that basis is one of the most influential philosophers of the current time, because it basically says primitive societies are better than corrupt modern society, so we should go back to nature and go back to the ways of these underdeveloped peoples. But then there's the other side of Rousseau, which is the collective will. The late Rousseau writes about the collective will, and that the individual counts nothing compared to the collective will. This is essentially the philosophy of the reign of terror in the French Revolution, and that's pretty much where Holdren is. So I would call him a Rousseauvian fanatic, in addition to being a Malthusian and a Darwinist and a Benthamite, and he wants to have the noble savage, roll back civilization, go back to pre-industrial civilization, or call it civilization if you want to, and at the same time he wants to impose the collective will. He even writes about infanticide. He says that infanticide is found in many primitive peoples. And he says, well, what that means is that these societies thought that the survival of the group and the collectivity was more important than the individual, so they didn't hesitate to kill babies, which implies Holdren's idea of civilization. It's a form of barbarity.
The event that began the slow collapse of the missionaries' vision took place in a then little-known outpost of Britain's vast and expanding empire. This is Tasmania, on the southern coast of Australia. What the British did on this small island was to resonate down through the Victorian age. When the British started to settle in Tasmania in 1803, they encountered the ancient Aboriginal peoples of the island. Only 5,000 strong, they had lived in complete isolation for 10,000 years, on the very edge of the habitable world. The settlers saw these people through ideas brought with them from Europe.
Quite early, you get expressions of disgust and shock about the way the Tasmanians lived. To the Europeans, it appeared that the Tasmanians were without culture, they were without religion, they were godless. So they looked upon the Tasmanians as people who'd been left behind by history. And they also related to a very popular idea of the late 18th century, that is the great chain of being, that the various races of humankind were arranged in hierarchical order, and that the Tasmanians were uniquely savage and primitive, and therefore can be treated almost as animals.
The British set about building a new capital and settling the surrounding countryside, land that for millennia had been the prime hunting ground of the Aboriginals. Out in these fields and pastures, far from the control of the authorities, the settlers were free to displace and abuse the Aboriginals.
From the 1820s, a huge amount of Aboriginal land has been taken up, and there is this enormous struggle between Aboriginal people and whites. Of course, it's very hard to document a lot of the settler violence because they know that it is against the law to kill Aboriginal people. They are being told that Aboriginal people are British subjects, but they certainly reveal in their diaries and journals the desire to kill Aboriginal people.
What became known as the Black War was a hidden conflict. The landscape itself was the only witness. The British settlers killed any Aboriginals they encountered. Whole groups were massacred. Kidnapping and rape became commonplace. The Aboriginals regularly attacked the settlers as they fought desperately to defend their land. And as the death toll rose, fear fused with hatred.
In such circumstances, it was very easy, on both sides no doubt, to regard the other side as being totally subhuman. I've got no doubt that the Aborigines thought the Europeans were people totally without morality or without any restraint. Equally, the Europeans slipped very quickly into a view that these people were animals and savages. So that conflict in such a racially divided society so easily tips over into an extreme feeling of hatred.
The death toll of the Black War had terrifying implications for the Tasmanian Aboriginals. The British, who arrived in ever-increasing numbers, could replace their dead. But the Aboriginals, only 5,000 strong before the war, could not. And by the end of the 1820s, they were at risk of being completely annihilated. The only man who had any hope of halting the violence was the colonial governor, George Arthur.
Now, the governor of Tasmania is an evangelical. He knows Wilberforce, and he is aware that his future and his reputation depends on how he deals with this problem above all else. Now, he's already been warned in the late 1820s by the British government that the rapidly declining numbers suggests that these people might be exterminated. And were this to happen, it would be an indelible stain on the reputation of the British Empire, but by implication it would be disastrous for his career.
Governor Arthur set out to save the Aboriginals from the violence of the settlers, and to convince them of his good intentions, he produced a poster that was attached to trees in their homelands. It showed a fantasy of interracial unity. The poster spoke of British justice, promising equality before the law. The white killer of an Aboriginal would be hanged. If an Aboriginal killed a settler, he would be hanged. The poster also propagated the lie that the British wanted to integrate with the Aboriginals. It was both a fiction and a complete failure, because out in the bush, the killings on both sides continued. And in 1830, Governor Arthur embarked upon a new policy. He ordered the army to sweep across the area of European settlement in an attempt to capture the remaining Aboriginals. He offered a bounty for every Aboriginal taken alive, but the operation was a complete failure. Only 2 were captured, an old man and a young boy. After years of guerrilla warfare, the last few hundred of the original 5,000 Aboriginals had learnt to hide themselves in the bush. Determined to save them, and determined to take their land for white settlement, Governor Arthur changed tactics. He now turned away from the army and looked instead to a missionary, George Augustus Robinson. He was the leader of a band of Aboriginal converts and was now hired to go into the bush and bring in the remaining Aboriginals.
Robinson took a message that the government wanted to come to some sort of an agreement, a negotiation, a peace treaty. And that is, I believe, undoubtedly the way the Aborigines saw it. They too saw this as a way to end a conflict which they had realised they could never win. They could never get rid of the Europeans. If they stayed and fought, they would be wiped out. And Robinson and his intermediaries convinced them that they should temporarily go to an island where they will be looked after and fed, and that they will ultimately come back to their homelands.
The island was called Flinders Island, and 300 Tasmanian Aboriginals who had been collected by Robinson were transported here. Robinson came with them in the official role of Chief Protector of Aboriginals, a job for which he was paid a total of £8,000, a small fortune in the 1830s. A settlement was constructed for them, complete with houses, farmland and a chapel. Robinson called it Point Civilization, and a local artist was brought in to paint the portraits of the last of the Tasmanians. Ginny had been captured by Robinson following the near annihilation of her people by the settlers. Wuradi had been a chief until his community had been wiped out by a European virus. Another local leader, Manalagena, had been lured to Flinders Island with the promise that the convicts who had attacked his people would be brought to justice. And there was Chuganini, whose husband had been murdered in front of her. All of them had seen their culture almost wiped out. What little was left, Robinson now set out to erase. Because Point Civilization was not merely a settlement, it was essentially a factory to transform so-called savages into civilized Christians.
To become a successful Christian, he believes you have to settle down, you have to live in a village. He wants to send the children to school, he wants to teach them to plough and to sow and to become agriculturalists.
Forced to adopt an alien way of life and confined to an island hundreds of miles from home, they began to succumb to European diseases and what the local doctor called dejected spirits.
They die one by one by one. Children are not being born, and there must have been this enormous sense of trauma amongst them. A people that had once been strong and healthy, suffering this enormous decline within a generation.
George Robinson, the supposed saviour of the Aboriginals, was reduced to sketching out his plan for their future graves.
Frequently he cries with the mourners, he weeps himself, he's so moved by their fate. But ultimately he says, well, it is better that they die here having learnt the message of the Gospels rather than be killed in the bush by the settlers. He finds a way to ease his own conscience so that Robinson's own beliefs, you see, protect him against a full accounting of what he was partly responsible for.
Of the 300 Aboriginals lured to Flinders Island, by the mid-1840s, around 260 were dead. Ginny, Manalagena and Wiradi had all succumbed. Truganini was one of the few survivors. She lived on, growing into old age. When she finally died in 1876, she was regarded by some as being the last full-blooded Tasmanian. A people whose story could be traced back 10,000 years had, within the span of a single lifetime, been almost exterminated.
The plan in centuries, and the astonishing thing is when you go into the United Nations, which was loosely based on the Soviet system, they plan certain parts of their agenda in 50-year plans, some in 100-year plans, and some even in 150-year plans for different aspects of it. The Russells, the Huxleys and so on, Brzezinskis, also use the same terminology with their long-term plans. And you've got to understand too that nothing in culture comes out from the grassroots. Even Plato talked about that thousands of years ago. He said that if it was a grassroots movement really coming from the people, then those in charge, the dominant minority, would lose control. Therefore, every change in culture, right down to fashion and music, and this was written 2,300 years ago, had to be authorized from the top and promoted from the top if it fitted with the continuance of control over the public.
What had happened in Tasmania was far from being a unique event. Across the world, indigenous peoples were being pushed to the brink of extinction. In the South African Cape, the Khoisan peoples had been driven from their land, enslaved and killed in their thousands by British settlers and the Boers. The same forces had also attacked the ancient San Bushmen of the Kalahari, hunting them down as if they were animals. In Newfoundland, the native Beothuk peoples had been completely wiped out by Europeans. And in South America, wars of extermination sanctioned by the Argentinian government were raging against the Pampas Indians. Everywhere, it seemed, white settlers were destroying indigenous peoples.
Welcome to this webcast lecture on Thomas Robert Malthus, an English economist whose work spans the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. Malthus's most famous and influential book is the essay concerning the principle of population, which was published in 1798. The thesis of the book is that there are natural limits to the growth of population, because as the population grows, the demand for food will outstrip the ability to produce it. This will cause starvation and various other economic effects which will limit population growth. The book was a bestseller and had a tremendous impact on the intellectual climate of the 19th century in England. The Dickensian preoccupation with orphans and motherless and fatherless children, problems of inheritance, problems of overcrowding in slums are essentially Malthusian in their outlook, and Malthus is an empiricist and he can be categorized in with the classical economists. He came after Adam Smith and was roughly a contemporary of Ricardo. As Smith and Ricardo did, he worked with data, analysing it, categorising it, trying to find laws, and for him the law was that of population and what we would now call demographics, that economic phenomena such as the rising and falling of prices and wages had an underlying cause which was the structure of the population. And he sets out his thesis pretty clearly right at the start of the book. He says that population, when unchecked, will grow in a geometrical ratio, but that subsistence for man will grow in an arithmetical ratio. And what he means by that is that if there's a man and a woman and they have, say, 4 children, and they have 4 children and so on and so on, you get a rapid exponential growth. But the means of supporting them, the food supply, housing, can only grow in an arithmetical ratio. It can maybe double. So quite quickly you're going to get a situation where the population outstrips the means of subsistence. Now his point is not that population is checked by periodic famines, although famine did take place. He's more interested in economic behaviour that anticipates the possibility of famine and the way that people adjust what they do to prevent famine. The book discusses the institution of marriage and how amongst rural people it was an institution for controlling and bringing into balance population growth with available farmland. So the convention was that the eldest son would not marry until he'd got his own farm. Now, at the end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century, because of the process of enclosures, you now had far fewer small family farms. They'd been enclosed to produce big industrial farms in the big fields we see around the countryside today. You had a lot of landless peasants who are now farm labourers and becoming factory labourers. Now, these people had no incentive to put off marriage and childbirth, and as a result of that, they were having larger families, Malthus noted. He also noted, from what he knew of history and the data he could gather, that population growth was checked by famine, but not in quite the straightforward way you would imagine. Rather than this exponential growth in population truncated by sudden famines, Malthus contends, the poor in particular have been subjected to what he calls oscillations, when there'll be attempts to bring extra farmland into cultivation. Marginal land will be brought in, marshes will be drained, and this will create actually a good times that's briefly this doubling of capacity within a village or town, but because they've drained the local swampland, will then prompt people using a sort of market mechanism to increase the size of their families until such time as that new capacity is fully used up, and then there'll be another sudden lurch forward. So when new land is brought into cultivation, wages rise, that leads to greater prosperity. People will have more children, larger families, that will then place pressure on the land, and there'll be another one of these periodic crises. So here we have a system that's very similar to Adam Smith's hidden hand of the market, very characteristic of the intellectual life of this time. Unusually for a classical economist, Malthus did not favour free trade, and he was in favour of keeping the corn laws. Just to recap, the corn laws were import duties that prevented cheaper foreign corn being brought into England. English corn was very, very expensive, partly because of the rising population and the supply and demand equation that would produce in Malthusian terms. Now, most liberal economists wanted the corn laws to go, even though that would entail the ruin of British agriculture, so that people could buy cheap cheaper food on the world market, and this would allow the population to grow, would encourage economic growth and industrialization of the country. But that population growth was exactly what Malthus was worried about, so he deliberately wanted food to be expensive so that a market mechanism would prompt people to keep their families small and the population down and more in line with the capacity of the country to feed it. Likewise, Malthus was deeply opposed to the new poor law and the workhouses. Appalling though these places were, he was against any measure that would keep the unemployed alive. The only possible thing for the unemployed to do, Malthus thought, would be to emigrate and set up new colonies where they would reproduce this sort of balance between subsistence and population in the new colonies. The last thing you needed to do was have a poor law system that would keep the poor alive and encourage them to have more children. At one point in his writings, Malthus says, "The poor law creates the poor that it maintains." Now, in the 200 years or so since Malthus was writing, he's been very widely vilified and derided because, of course, the very large increase in world population he predicted did take place, but starvation is a thing unknown, at least in the developed world. There are still famines in Africa, so if you globalize his whole system, you could say that it's correct in that sense. There were famines throughout the first half of the 19th century, but the last mass famine in Europe took place in the 1840s in Ireland, and that really had highly specific reasons to do with absentee landlordism and overdependence on one single food crop, the potato. So basically, it was a case of Malthus had simply got it wrong on his main prediction, that the population grew very, very considerably, but nobody was particularly well fed in the cities, the industrial cities, but there was no mass starvation as he predicted. Also, there was the intellectual critique that Malthus had failed to realize that each extra mouth was also an extra pair of hands, and that productivity could increase, including agricultural productivity, using technology on a scale that Malthus simply hadn't foreseen. Also, the widespread adoption of contraception in the 20th century, particularly in association with the liberation of women from having a lot of children, has slowed down population growth to a point where in much of Western Europe it's just at the reproduction level. Couples, a man and a woman, will have 2 children and simply reproduce themselves. The average is somewhere between 2 and 3, so the population growth is steady. Also, it's the case that improved child mortality figures, the number of babies that survive in the early years, does not necessarily lead to a population boom, because if parents know that their children are going to survive, they're very inclined to have fewer children, and you can see that phenomena in the third world, that as living standards go up, population growth slows, and that's particularly true when women are given rights, because they want to have a life and not simply be constantly giving birth to babies that then die in the early years of their life. So all these economic, medical, technological and sociological innovations that might vaguely be grouped together as social democratic or at least modern are a reason why Malthus's ideas went into abeyance. But more recently we've seen something like Malthusian ideas coming to the fore again in association with the Green Movement, the idea that economic growth has reached now its limits, and that starvation on a massive scale is back on the agenda unless the population is controlled, that we didn't solve the Malthusian dilemma in the 19th and 20th centuries by technology. We simply exported the problem to the third world, and that by using agriculture, highly efficient agriculture, that's true, that produces a lot of protein and carbohydrates, but it does so at the expense of a mechanized agriculture that's highly dependent on fossil fuels, the use of which is creating the greenhouse problem, and anyway the fossil fuels are going to go. A generation ago it would have seemed scarcely credible, but it does seem that in the intellectual climate of the first decade of the 21st century, that Thomas Robert Malthus, and some of his ideas at least, are coming back in from the intellectual cold.
Well, we've had a previous broadcast, I think, where we talked about the threat of global warming.
Right.
And the problem with something like global warming is to say, well, if you have a problem of this nature, what is the climate of ideas that makes this possible? Why do people believe it? It's kind of like September 11th and the terror fraud, global war on terror, if you're confronted with that, you have to say, why do people fall for such a thing? And then the answer gets to be something to do with neocon ideology, Carl Schmitt, Hitler's lawyer, Leo Strauss, things like that. What we've got today...
Oh, Webster, there's one thing I want to slow you down on. A lot of people say that you're being dramatic when you say that the neocons are related to the Nazis and that you discredit your argument because of that. And I've heard you say that Hitler's lawyer was a Nazi. Now, does this mean that he was smarter than Hitler?
Well, it's just a simple fact. I mean, we don't have to comment on anybody's degree of intelligence. Adolf Hitler, a German political leader, retained a lawyer for the Nazi Party. The guy's name was Carl Schmitt. The case involved was the coup d'etat in Prussia in July of 1932 that had to be argued, whether it was legal or not, had to be argued at the Constitutional Court of the Weimar Republic in Leipzig. And the person who argued the case for Hitler, for the Nazi Party, for the illegal government, the Nazi government of the state of Prussia, was Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt is the protector and the guy who launched the career of Leo Strauss. He got Leo Strauss a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation and sponsored his early career. Leo Strauss is openly the guru of all the neocons. And there it is. And anybody who denies that is simply denying the obvious facts. The neocons go back to Hitler's lawyer, and what is most important is their doctrine does. But we've got to move on to Malthus. We're going to never...
Fine. Thank you for clarifying that.
Unless we can deal with this. This is all written up, by the way, in my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA. And people who deny that connection simply haven't read 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA, which you can get from Amazon and many other places. But let's rush back to Malthus. What we've got right now is a huge historical worldwide Malthusian campaign around global warming. What does this Malthus signify? Malthus was a parson. He was a clergyman of the Church of England during the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 1800s, about 200 years ago now, and he wrote his books on population. He's associated with this famous argument that population increases geometrically. Population goes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on, but food supply increases arithmetically. That is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, whatever that is. Those premises are absolutely wrong. It's found, for example, today, that when you get a degree of economic development, and this is what we're seeing, at least in some parts of the world, as soon as you bring people into the middle class, probably the last century is a good sample, when you bring people into the middle class, you take them out of peasant life, where the tendency is to have many children, and bring them into middle class life, where the capital investment per child goes up in education and healthcare and so on, that the population begins to level off. So the geometric thesis is a fraud. And the other one is, of course, that the arithmetic increase of food supply does not obtain in real history. In other words, when you have periods of rapid technological innovation, you actually get increases in the food supply that are not arithmetic, that are at least momentarily geometric. So he's wrong on both points, and the thing about Malthus that always stays with his followers is the systematic denial and exclusion of technology, science, innovation, improvements of methods, and so forth. In other words, the fruits of human reason are systematically denied by Malthus. So we're told with Malthus that the human condition is that there's overpopulation, that poverty and misery are inevitable, and that science can do absolutely nothing to change this. It's a form of severe historical and cultural pessimism. And of course, Malthus was the main ideologue of the British Empire. This is very important. The most reactionary political formation of the past 250 years, something that dominated the world. The British Empire, India, Africa, Canada, Australia, all these places, but especially when they're dealing with non-white populations, the policies are all Malthusian. They're all aimed at wiping out populations. And I guess that's the other thing, is if you have governments that try to implement Malthusian policies, then you're going to have genocide, because that is the way they respond to what they think the predicament is. If you have Malthusian bureaucrats running a government, there's a very great danger that the policies that come out of it will be genocidal. And that's the case of the United States, Britain, and quite a few others today. Now, Malthus, in many ways, he puts together, he summarizes a mentality which is typical of oligarchy. If we go back to the archaic period in Greece, say about 1000 BC, and in the following centuries, there is, if you look in the ancient Greek writers, an explanation, why did the Trojan War occur 1000 BC or thereabouts? And the answer to that is, well, the Trojan War was necessary because there were too many people, too many humans oppressing the breast of Mother Earth, and therefore there had to be this massacre. That is essentially Malthusianism in a nutshell. Specifically, Malthus was this country parson, and what he did was to copy. He's a plagiarist. This is what is very little known about him. He's an intellectual fraud. He copied all of his ideas from a Venetian original, and this is Gianmaria Ortes, O-R-T-E-S. Very little known, but known to Marx and Engels and a couple of others. Marx actually says he thinks he's a great guy. Gianmaria Ortes was a defracked Venetian priest. Around 1790, he wrote a book on population, where he formulated for the first time, and this is his contribution, if you like, the notion of carrying capacity. Gianmaria Ortes says that the absolute upper limit for the globe is a population of 3 billion, and that was in 1790. And he says that we don't want to get to a situation where people are packed in like herrings in a barrel. Again, the Malthusian mindset. Ortes is also the inventor of the notion of a zero-sum game. He says if one country gains, then it means another country is automatically going to lose. He always imagines the world as a fixed, finite pie. Again, not what you see empirically, because technological improvements and science have been able to radically increase the size of the pie, but Ortes cannot see this. And again, always this exclusion of technology. There's never an idea that science or technology could make things better. Ortes spent a lot of his time trying to figure out gambling. Let me just say in passing, because I can't do justice to the importance of Ortes, that all of Malthus and indeed all of Jeremy Bentham is based on this degenerate Venetian original. Now, that gets us to the influence of this. Jeremy Bentham is the founder of British liberalism, right? He's the philosopher of utilitarianism, the greatest good of the greatest number. Bentham is, of course, the founder of the British intelligence agencies at the beginning of the 19th century. Bentham is a kind of conveyor belt from Malthusian ideas to the British Liberal Party and to pretty much leftists around the world. If you know Charles Dickens, right, if you know a novel like Hard Times, the Gradgrind School, the Facts of Thomas Gradgrind, that's pretty much Bentham and to some degree Malthus. Or, pardon me, if you know the Christmas Carol with Uncle Scrooge, everybody's seen this. Are there no prisons, are there no workhouses? That's pure Bentham. Or indeed the famous line, if they be like to die, they better do it and decrease the surplus population. Pure Malthus by way of Bentham. The other one to mention is that Charles Darwin and his doctrines, the struggle for survival, the survival of the fittest and all this, is also based on Malthus pretty directly. And it leads to social Darwinism. And out of social Darwinism, the notion that human society is the struggle of the law of the jungle, it's a kind of ideology that free market ideologues have always loved. Then we get Nietzsche and the will to power, and from this comes Nazism. So you can pretty much trace Malthusian thinking in various streams through the 19th century, infecting leftists in one way through Bentham, but then also coming back to impact the right-wing movements, and in particular the ultra-right-wing or indeed Nazi movement through Nietzsche.
And these are sciences which were taught down through the ages, are still taught today to the big players, and they've used it to the full in the 20th century, now into the 21st century with the use of television, mass communications, radio, etc. Everything has been given to us for the appropriate time and stage in the actual planning. And for those who are coming into this kind of study, It's best to go into the books, as I say, written by the big players themselves. They love to boast. Kissinger's got lots of books out there, so has Brzezinski. These are probably two of the master players in geopolitics. Try to stay away from all the conspiracy books. They're also put out there on purpose, very fascinating books, but they lead you in circles forever without giving you the overall picture to the fact that every generation has a purpose up until this present time. And in a post-industrial era, these big boys have decided, and their masters too, that we are simply superfluous and they no longer need us.
In the aftermath of abolition, competition from new sugar producers began to undermine Britain's once mighty sugar plantations. And as their estates rotted, the former slave owners began to blame their ruin on the people who had once made them rich.
When the Caribbean plantations started to lose money in a big way, they fell back to the stereotype of the lazy Negro. The planters were then able to say to the abolitionists and to Britain, look, we are now in ruin because we no longer have the freedom to coerce blacks to work. We no longer have the freedom to drive them to work. These people are intrinsically lazy. You know, you were arguing that they were human beings, a man and a brother, but in fact they're not. They're still at the level of beasts.
Whereas up to the end of the 1830s, it's been pretty unpopular to talk about Africans in those ways, and the respectable talk of the humanitarians about Africans has been, you know, far more prevalent. By the mid-1840s, that's beginning to shift.
Those who argued that abolition had been a failure due to the laziness and savagery of the slaves now claim that the Christian vision of a civilizing empire was also doomed.
You might say that the moral momentum ran out of the abolitionist movement. People found that other races were not becoming civilized. There was something difficult. They fought back. They didn't seem to learn as fast as we would appreciate, to make them more pliable for us. Christian optimism about the spread of civilization and the Christianization of people of color around the world began to drain away.
If the non-white races seemed to reject the message of the missionaries, some in Britain began to ask if they could be civilized at all. One of those who thought not was the eminent writer and historian Thomas Carlyle. In 1849, Carlyle published an essay entitled Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, in which he appealed for a return to some form of slavery. It was printed and reprinted in magazines across the world and helped transform the 19th century debate about race.
Carlyle's voice is a kind of prophetic voice, you know, which booms out from his study in Cheyne Walk in Chelsea, and he writes these, you know, extraordinarily powerful prophetic pieces which were read, you know, with gusto by Victorians, and I mean, one can imagine them all sitting around their fires reading the latest periodical that's come out with this flow of rhetoric. In this case, in the Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, the flow of rhetoric is about the necessity for inequality. Inequality is the proper way to run a society. Those who know should rule those who don't know. Men should rule women, white people should rule black, educated people should rule the masses.
The depths to which these ideas became embedded within mid-Victorian society was revealed by one of the most controversial events of the whole 19th century. In 1865, the people of Morant Bay, a tiny settlement in East Jamaica, attacked a courthouse during a minor demonstration.
In return, the Governor-General imposed martial law and ordered his soldiers to go on a killing spree. It was a killing time. nearly 500 people were just executed. 600 people just flogged, some of them to the point of death. And 1,000 homes torched. Enormous disparity in terms of the retaliation against these people. And you know, when all this was being done, the so-called rebels didn't put up a fight. You know, when their houses were being burned, they weren't terrorists, they weren't murderers, you know. All they wanted was for the judiciary to treat them with a sense of justice.
The man who ordered the killings was Governor Edward Eyre. And when news of what he had done reached Britain, the liberal establishment was shocked.
And the cause is taken up by the old abolitionists who've kept going and kept going and kept going. And the old anti-slavery societies kind of wrench themselves back into action and mobilize themselves again. And all the ladies who've been doing it for decades, when the men have gone off and done more interesting things, you know, there they are with the machinery still in place that can be mobilized when you need to.
Their tactic was to put Governor Eyre on trial for mass murder. But in court, he was acquitted, due in part to a huge wave of popular support.
He had the whole of the House of Lords, parliamentarians, bishops, priests, the establishment, the aristocracy backing him, saying that he was justified in imposing severe order on these people because that's the only language they could understood, because the black people were brutes.
Eyre's defense was orchestrated by the high priest of the new racism, Thomas Carlyle. But behind him stood many members of the British literary elite, all of whom made known their support for Governor Eyre and his actions at Morant Bay. The art critic and writer John Ruskin, the author of Vanity Fair, William Makepeace Thackeray, the Reverend Charles Kingsley, writer of the children's classic The Water Babies, and Charles Dickens, the most celebrated author of the century.
The notion of treating other people with some degree of justice and rule of law finally went out of the window and was demolished in the 1860s over Morant Bay. You know, from then on we knew that the empire was about ruling people with the maximum degree of coercion.
Hence, we have big foundations coming forward and organizations like the Optimum Population Trust who have decided to come out openly and demand that governments start radically reducing the populations. We are now the useless eaters, as Lord Bertrand Russell called us. Our ideas, our opinions on everything, our worldview, even to do with population and the fake view that we're overpopulated, is all projected to us by the mainstream media working in concert for their masters. And we begin to parrot what we hear through repetition, and that's so important, as repetition with slogans and catchphrases. And once you hear it happening in your own local group, your milieu, then you know it's working. And the camera can make anything appear to be true. You'll see that in India, for instance, they always use the same streets of Bombay to make you think that you're massively overcrowded, and that's the impression people think of the entire Indian continent. The Indian continent is huge, with thousands and thousands of miles of forest where no one lives. It's the same in Africa too. China, being the model state for the world, for instance, put into effect the United Nations policy to the extreme with its population reduction and the movements of people off of the rural areas into cities. They started that years ago. Right now, they're in the process of moving 200 million more people off into the major cities, and that's the major newspapers. The cities appear to be crowded because everyone's being moved into them. In the Western world, since the 1950s, again under the term of urban sprawl and stopping urban sprawl, the Western countries also signed agreements to do no more building in the outskirts and of the major cities. All existing buildings have to be used or else knocked down, replaced with even higher ones. But regardless, with the immigration and the free flow of people now from third world countries, the Western countries appear to be overcrowded. And yet the UN's own statistics show, And so the national census show that the Europeans, for instance, Canadians and Americans, who have been here for a couple of hundred years, are actually in decline. So the overpopulation problem is simply an image projected by the media as more and more people are crammed into the same cities and they bring more immigrants in to fill them. But I also realized the system of schooling when I was going to school was bogus. The histories were bogus, and I was very, very lucky to have access to very old libraries, town libraries. Some of them had reference books going back into the 1700s, written at the time. When you compared the histories I was being taught in school to the histories that were written at the time, they were completely different. You had a deeper understanding of how geopolitics had been used in the past to even populate the country of Canada. London couldn't get immigrants to go off into the new colonies. What they did for Australia was to create so many laws that you couldn't help but break them, and poverty. And therefore, stealing a loaf of bread to feed you or your family would get you deported to Australia with your family. That's how they populated Australia, crime. They created the laws for crime. With Scotland, they had a rebellion, which could have been rigged, and I often think it was, and the whole of Scotland was punished. And they deported millions of the Scots off to the Americas to populate the Americas. This is geopolitics in action. That's how it works. And whole peoples are often moved from their land because the elite masters want them elsewhere to be productive.
Some of the new ideas about race in the High Victorian Age drew their evidence from the world of the dead. Based on the study of corpses and skeletons, the burgeoning science of anatomy laid the foundations for a new scientific racism. In Britain, the most important race scientist was a now forgotten Edinburgh surgeon. Ruined by a body-snatching scandal in the 1820s, he had fled Britain in disgrace. But in the 1840s, Dr. Robert Knox resurfaced with the publication of a new book.
Race is everything. Literature, science, art, in a word, civilization depends on it.
For Robert Knox in that book, race is everything. It determined your character, it determined your position in civilization, it determined your destiny.
Can the black races become civilized? I should say not.
He saw racial conflict and extermination happening all around the world. It was natural for him to believe that racial types were bound to struggle and that the superior races would dominate the naturally inferior ones.
The Saxon race will never tolerate them, never amalgamate, never be at peace. It is a war of extermination. One or other must fall.
Robert Knox was not a lone voice. In America, a group led by the renowned craniologist Samuel George Morton had begun to collect the skulls of different races and compare them.
Skulls were chosen to be measured because it was reckoned that the skull was the container of the most important part of the human body, the brain. The bigger the skull, the bigger the brain. The shape of the skull, the shape of the brain.
The American School of Race Scientists concluded that the races, as measured through their skulls, were so different as to be separate species. Tasmanians, Africans, American Indians were not the lower races of men. They were perhaps not fully human at all. One writer compared the extermination of these races by white settlers as being like the melting of snow before the advancing rays of the sun.
How they stopped rebellion in the past was to give us an idea of what they called democracy. They knew from the Chartist movement in Britain, for instance, and elsewhere, other countries, people were demanding rights for the first time. And so once again, they gave us champions to speak on our behalf. which calmed the people down, thinking for the first time in history, the people were involved in their own destiny creation, and nothing was further from the truth. Because the planners knew that once you bring people into a country or a continent, create real wealth for them and get businesses going, clear the land, drain the swamps, and so on, they can take it all away from you through laws 200 years down the road. And that's what's happening now. Long-term geopolitics once more. And if you think I'm kidding about this, go into the history books written at the time. They're still there in some of the libraries. And you can also go into the art of geopolitics. There's even videos on YouTube on Brzezinski boasting about how he set up the Taliban in Afghanistan. You'll see him encourage them to fight the Soviets at that time in the 1970s. And he actually says, yours is a holy war. This man, who obviously believes in nothing but himself and his own peer group, is encouraging another people to go and fight a holy war, a jihad. And he uses these terms against the Soviets, knowing full well, once it was set up and it was backed by the CIA, that 10, 15 years down the road, there'd be a problem. And then they'd have to go to war with the very group they'd created to fight the Soviets. That's what's happening today.
Ladies and gentlemen, Robin, thank you very much for your, as always, elegant and eloquent introduction. I've heard him many times when he was running the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And if anything, his eloquence and elegance has increased ever since he's been rehabilitated in this society here. I'm also delighted to speak under the sponsorship of the Whitehead lecture series. John Whitehead, whom I've been privileged to know for many years, I will not talk about at length, but suffice it to say that he was, in my judgment, the best Deputy Secretary of State the United States has ever had. He should have been Secretary of State. And then finally, and the third comment, which may, however, precipitate some rapid departures from this room, but I want to emphasize that I speak for myself only. I speak for no one else. The views that I express are only my views. I want to emphasize that. Well, we meet at a time, of course, when the new president is assuming office in the United States. And he's doing so in the midst of a crisis of confidence in America's capacity to exercise effective leadership in world affairs. That's a stark thought, but it is a fact. Though American leadership over the last number of decades has been essential to global stability and to global development, after the United States replaced Great Britain as the key power in the world, it is still nonetheless a fact, a sad fact, that the cumulative effects of national financial self-indulgence, of an unnecessary war of our own choice, and of ethical transgressions have cumulatively discredited that leadership. And making matters worse today, we have the financial crisis. And all of that is occurring in the context of the simultaneous interaction between two very basic transforming developments on the world scene. So the picture is complex indeed. The first change concerns the surfacing of global issues pertaining to human well-being as critical international issues. And that's new in human history. Issues such as climate, environment, starvation, health, social inequality. All of these are compounding the complexity of the global context. And these issues, furthermore, are made more acute by the coincidental phenomenon of what I have called in my writings the global political awakening. This is a truly transformative event on the global scene, namely that for the first time in human history, for the first time in all of human history, almost all of mankind is politically awake, activated, politically conscious, and interactive. There are only a few pockets of humanity here or there in the remotest corners of the world which are not politically alert and interactive with the political turmoil and stirrings and aspirations around the world. And all of that is creating a worldwide surge in the quest for personal dignity and cultural respect in a diversified world, sadly accustomed for many centuries to domination by one portion of the world of another. That is an enormous change. And beyond that is interacting with still a further change, namely in the distribution of global power. It pertains to something very obvious of which we're aware, but which it is important to register. Namely, that we're living at a time of a basic shift away from the 500 years long global domination by the Atlantic powers. It is the countries that have been located on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, and let us recall them: Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Great Britain, more recently the United States, that have dominated world affairs. And that shift now is taking us towards Asia. It is not the end of the preeminence of the Atlantic world, but it is now the surfacing of the Pacific region, and most notably Japan, the #2 economic power, and China, a putative global power, that are now occupying a preeminent place in the global hierarchy. And of course, beyond them, there is the question of India's future development, though it is currently still in the wings. And it is also complicated by the reappearance of Russia, which is something to be welcomed, but a Russia which is still restless, rather unclear about its own definition, very ambivalent about its recent past, and very insecure about its place in the world. And these new and old major powers face still yet another novel reality, in some respects unprecedented. And it is that while the lethality of their power is greater than ever, their capacity to impose control over the politically awakened masses of the world is at a historical low. I once put it rather pungently, and I was flattered that the British Foreign Secretary repeated this, as follows. Namely, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people, literally. It was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control. And of course, that bears directly on the use of force, particularly by societies that are culturally alien over other societies.
But the theory that was to have the most powerful impact upon race came not from the anatomists or the skull measurers, but from the work of one of the 19th century's greatest minds.
The Origin of Species really threw a bombshell, first of all into science. It really invented the science of biology, and then into religion and into society. And what Darwin did in some ways was to give an alibi for being a judge. If evolution had changed the races and the species of the world, why hadn't it done the same to humans?
Many believed that Darwin's laws had done just that. Natural selection, they claimed, neatly explained and justified the global expansion of the great British race.
Life favors a hierarchy of specialists. And you find that throughout the plant and the animal world. There are bugs on top of bugs on top of bugs, each one surviving at another's expense, each one filling a niche that another can't occupy. People, Darwin said, are the same way. They are expansive organisms. In other words, Englishmen are just like other organisms. They are successful because they are good at expanding.
Those who understood colonialism and human competition in terms of Darwin's theories became known as the social Darwinists. Men like the radical biologist Thomas Henry Huxley and the famous economist Herbert Spencer. And social Darwinism foresaw very different fates for the various races of mankind.
Evolution was in operation. It was advancing the most recently evolved, the most successfully evolved, that is, the Northern Europeans, the British. But evolution also suggested that there had to be losers in this great cosmic process. And the losers were those peoples who could not compete. And once put into competition with superior races, were doomed to disappear. And this was likely to happen to all the native peoples in North America, in the Pacific, and in Africa.
Across the world, the crimes of imperialism now came to be taken as proof that the social Darwinists were right. In North America, centuries of disease and war had devastated the Native Americans. Whole nations had been all but annihilated. In parts of the Australian mainland, the peoples of the outback were, it seemed, going the same way as their cousins in Tasmania. And across Africa, the scramble for empire had brought the might of Europe to bear against innumerable peoples, killing literally millions. The social Darwinists predicted a future in which these races, like many animal species, would only be remembered as curios, stuffed exhibits in anthropological museums. The white man's burden and the Christian dream of benign imperialism were rendered obsolete.
Old missionaries who still talked about the equality of humanity and talked about everyone descended from Adam and Eve and talked about that the truth, the only truth, came from the Bible, were seen as being extraordinarily old-fashioned, who simply had failed to come to terms with the great scientific thinking of the age.
And these racial theories were not only applied in new colonies, but also in the oldest parts of the empire. In the traditional story of imperialism, British India has usually been represented as an example of benign imperial rule. The British Raj, we are told, was run by men who were competent, professional and wise, men who brought order and prosperity to a chaotic land. But there is an aspect of Indian history that has been written out of this account of the imperial past. In the mid-1870s, the Great Deccan Plain of India was affected by the climatic phenomenon we now know as El Niño, and within months, millions of peasants had begun to starve.
The monsoons had failed, people had eaten their food reserves. India stood on the precipice of a great human tragedy. At this point, the Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, was totally absorbed in what was probably the largest party in world history, celebrating the coronation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India. This is one of the great catering feats in history, since it meant wining and dining more than 60,000 satraps and princes and retainers and friends of the British Empire in India over the course of a long week.
As Lord Lytton and the ruling elite of the Raj feasted at banquets and posed for official photographs, millions were slowly dying in the countryside, and the Viceroy justified his inaction with arguments gleaned from the social Darwinists.
This was a very, very crass use of a Darwinian evolutionary notion of survival of the fittest, whereby a famine could be actually seen as an instrument of Darwinian winnowing. Yes, that people who were unfit would effectively perish as a result of this, and to intervene to stop them perishing was really to interfere with almost a rule of nature.
What made the famines especially deadly was that the British had dismantled ancient systems that had for centuries prevented food shortages from turning into famines.
If you'd had a poor monsoon and there was a food shortage, many people still had enough. They may have had less, but they would have had enough because they grew their own food, or they would have had access to it from other groups in the community who would share it with them during a time of crisis.
All this had been wiped away when the British forced the poorest peasants to grow cash crops like wheat and rice for export, thereby ushering them into a global market. And in the 1870s, that market condemned them to death. By 1877, millions in southern and central India were starving. In desperation, parents sold their children for scraps of food. Many thousands committed suicide. And in some places, the people were forced into cannibalism. And all the while, the food that could have saved them was piled up on the docks of Madras, ready to be shipped to Britain and America. But to Lord Lytton, it was no more than an unfortunate byproduct of the iron laws of social Darwinism.
If you read the letters of Lord Lytton, what is so striking about them is not simply their fanatical devotion to the market and market forces. It's not simply their parsimony and desire to spend as little as possible, but the enormous calm with which they accept the fact that millions of Indians would die, because these are Indians they believe are the useless part of the population, the poorest of the poor, people condemned to death by nature.
When finally Lytton was pressured into action, his solution proved just as deadly as the famine itself.
Lord Lytton sets up a system of outdoor relief that looks more like Nazi concentration camps than anything representing decent human charity. First of all, there's the obligatory test. You can't be relieved, that is, given a job or food within 10 miles of your residence. You must walk. And you must walk sometimes distances of hundreds of kilometers, and tens of thousands of people die in the course of that. Then you're put to work doing heavy labor, very heavy labor, breaking stone, working on the railroads, and you're confined then to squalid camps where your daily diet is in caloric terms less than that provided to inmates of Buchenwald and other Nazi concentration camps. They become literally and simply death camps. And perhaps worst of all, children were now too weak and small to do the necessary work. Children became the main victims of Lytton's cool-hearted policy.
Eight million Indians died in the famines of the 1870s. But they were not the only famines of the British Raj, and they were not the last. Famines returned in the 1880s and the 1890s, and in all, almost 30 million Indians starved to death under British rule. A story airbrushed out of the glorious accounts of the Raj and the men who ruled over it.
Long-term strategies, well, that's how history has always been run. If you can go into the books where you find the British Home Office is mentioned, study the history of the diplomatic corps, because the diplomats were spies. They would go into territories, set up embassies, collect intelligence data for future invasions. Their job was also to try and grab the rights of minerals, gold, silver, etc. across the planet, all natural resources, and find ways, long-term strategy, to either bribe it off the present rulers of those countries or else create an ultimate war with them and simply steal it under the guise of occupation. We're living through a stage today, as I say, where this is all coming to a culmination. This is the post-industrial era. We're post-technical almost in the West. It's all done in other countries, all the technical stuff. And Brzezinski himself talks about the technocratic era, where the future will be for an elite with a highly trained bureaucracy underneath them and scientific elite who will not need the human labor that they've needed in the past. Human labor that is excessive and is unemployed and is hungry is now a threat to that established elite. So now they're doing something which they can only do to the human species. They don't need to do this with animals. With animals, just go out and hunt them and kill them. We are the only species that has to be convinced to allow ourselves, for the good of all, to be sterilized and bring down the population through abortion on one end and euthanasia on the other, under the guise to save the planet. And unfortunately, with the massive propaganda campaigns that are all over media in every country at the same time, with all the big foundations backing them with unlimited financing. Remember, the foundations are owned by the international bankers themselves. Then they can pull all of this off, and unfortunately it really is working. In kindergarten now, you walk into a kindergarten anywhere in Europe or Americas, and you'll see the rainbow inside every single one of them. You'll see all the terms about the world. Here's the globe, we're all global. And you'll see the greening messages everywhere, everywhere, and how sacrifice will have to be made to save the world and the planet and future generations of society. Sacrifice. You tie that together with the institutions that were comprised of the Fabian Society. It was a member of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That's one society. The Council on Foreign Relations is also the same thing as the Royal Institute for International Affairs. They are what Thatcher and Professor Carroll Quigley called the parallel government. They have told us what the future is going to be. Some of their members have even written books about the need to cull off massive amounts of the population by any means possible. And so we see this final stage being pushed as they convince us that we are the problem. The Club of Rome, that also belongs to the same group, in the 1990s, the two founders said that back in the 1970s at the Club of Rome, they were given the task as a premier think tank for the globe, for this global society, the task to find ways of reducing the population and controlling the people to go along with this, convincing the public how to go along with it. And they said they'd looked at all possible means of doing so. What had worked before? Again, geopolitics, strategy. Under warfare conditions, the public will give up freedom. The public will be directed by governments, bureaucracies, and police, military, etc. Under warfare, the public sacrifice. They'll have less food, they'll ration stuff. They go along with it to save themselves. Therefore, they'd have to find a warfare strategy, a reason for war. And what they came up with was that man was the enemy of the planet. They said that the idea that global warming could be created and blamed upon mankind would fit the bill. These are the words they used. That would fit the bill, written in the 1970s, and decided at the think tanks then, and published by the guys involved in a book called The First Global Revolution, well worth reading. When they hit upon an idea from a premier think tank, they will never change that agenda. I've said before, it wouldn't matter if we're up to our eyes in snow all year round. they will still stick to global warming. That's the agenda. Now, of course, they've changed it slightly to climate change, which simply means changes in the weather. And they're in the process now of convincing the general public to be afraid of summer, for instance. It's all done through the alteration and distortion of perceptions. Massive psychology is used on all of this. And they certainly understand mass psychology of the general public. These boys don't simply announce things or make up a wish list of the future and send it up the chimney to Santa Claus. When they come up with an idea, they implement it. I've followed the United Nations Department of Statistics as they announce every single year the sperm count of the Western male, which has been falling drastically since the 1950s. They say that it's down by about 75–85%. Now, when something like that's happened across the whole of Europe and the Americas in 50 years, and they suddenly started noticing it 50 years ago, sudden onset, and there's no crisis made about it. There's no comeback after announcing the statistics. They just tell you the cold, hard statistics and go off to the next statistic on some other topic. That means it's part of the agenda. Otherwise, it would be a crisis. If this wasn't planned and part of the agenda, believe you me, it would be a crisis if they didn't authorize it. And now they tell us that the average American has less than 20% sperm and only about 15% is motile. That's not a coincidence. What happened in the 1950s to start out this ball rolling? In the 1950s, they suddenly put all the known female synthetic estrogens into food supply. They put it in baby foods. Procter & Gamble were the first one to admit, after investigation 40 years later, that they were using a rinse to supposedly sterilize the baby bottles, and it contained bisphenol A. An odd thing to rinse baby bottles with, when bisphenol A is the very thing that attacks young male children at that age and stops the testes from developing properly. You go back even further into more detail and you find out that the cosmetic industry were using insufflatants. Insufflation is a technique where certain carriers are put into the creams themselves, and these creams then absorb into the skin, carrying other chemicals with them. They're almost like they carry the payloads into the target in the bloodstream.
Social Darwinism had justified genocidal policies in the colonies, and in the same years it also fueled new fears amongst the British elite, fears of other dangerous races living in their midst, the working classes of their own cities.
Race and class are actually very close to each other. If you look at books about race around Darwin's time, they often talk about the Cockney race, the English country race, the Scottish race. There were drawings of the head of a typical member of the Cockney race, and the word was used quite seriously. There were maps made of where the criminal races lived. These were the rookeries. This was the East End, the melting pot of all the horrors that are going to go out and infect the rest of the population.
Race scientists and social reformers visited prisons to study the criminal races at first hand, and among them was Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Galton was terrified by the fact that the underclass were reproducing faster than the middle classes. Darwinian law had, it seemed, been turned on its head. The least fit were surviving. Reversing this situation became his mission.
Darwin had looked backwards. Where had we come from? Galton turned the telescope around and looked forward. Where were we going? And he devoted much of the rest of his life to the idea of understanding Homo sapiens, us, as a species and trying to direct where Homo sapiens was going to go in order to become more sapient, more wise in the future, more of a genius, and less of what he saw, more stupid, more ignorant, and more decayed.
Galton designed a new science of human selective breeding. He dreamed of encouraging the middle classes to have more children and inhibiting breeding amongst the lower and criminal classes. And he named his new science Eugenics. In the last decades of the 19th century, it became widely respected, attracting an array of high-profile supporters.
They included many of the great figures of the late 19th, early 20th century, people like George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill, all of them absolutely convinced eugenicists.
In the first years of the 20th century, all the racial theories developed in the Victorian age, eugenics, social Darwinism, and scientific racism, came together in a forgotten outpost of colonialism. This is Namibia, but at the dawn of the 20th century, it was the German colony of Southwest Africa and home to an ancient people called the Herero. In 1904, they rebelled against the brutality of German rule. What followed was to prefigure the worst crimes of the 20th century. The Germans committed innumerable massacres and atrocities, but they were unable to hunt down and destroy all the Herero people across such a vast landscape. And when the Nama, another of the Namibian peoples, rose up, the Germans turned instead to a recent invention, the concentration camp. In these camps, the Herero and Nama were imprisoned and enslaved. Thousands were worked to death, others raped, beaten, or simply murdered by the guards. The most infamous and deadly of the camps was at a place called Shark Island.
Shark Island was established for the express purpose of killing people. Anybody placed on that island, everybody knew they were going to die. People knew that, the German officers knew that. If I were to have to use the language of the Nazi period, then I would certainly see Shark Island as a death camp.
The people were band together in Shark Island from all over Namibia. Hereros, Tamaras, Bushman, Nama. And they had cool-blooded murder there. My own family, my ancestors, they were also killed there.
In this desolate place, on the southern edge of Africa, 3,500 people were exterminated with the speed and efficiency that was to become the hallmark of 20th century slaughter.
The genocides which took place in Namibia in 1904 to 1909, they are the precursor to what happens in the Nazi period. They are the precursor. They have the same symptoms in the sense that you can see the bureaucratization of mass killing. And this, for me, is the central thing. It's not just killing for killing. No. It's a combination between killing and bureaucracy.
Today, Shark Island is a campsite for tourists. The Africans who were frozen and starved to death here have been almost erased from memory. But a century after the Namibian genocide, the true horror of what happened on Shark Island is beginning to re-emerge. In a recently discovered mass grave, just a few kilometers from the site of Shark Island, lie some of the victims of the 20th century's first genocide. Other victims were denied even the meager dignity of a mass grave. They became the raw material of racial science. Their skulls and even severed heads were sold to museums in Europe and used to prove the inferiority of Africans. The trade in skulls was so accepted that it was even depicted on a postcard. In the aftermath of the genocide, German racial scientists continued to use Namibia as a field laboratory and the African peoples who had survived as their subjects. In 1908, a eugenicist called Eugen Fischer traveled to the small town of Rehoboth, home to a people of mixed Boer and African heritage who called themselves the Rehoboth Bastards. Fischer and his assistants spent months photographing, measuring, and examining the inhabitants of this town, people whose descendants still live here.
The person at the bottom there is my grandfather, Malcolm McNabb, and above him is his brother, Charles McNabb. My grandfather used to talk a lot about what they did, measurements, the eyes, the nose, the lips, the ears, hair, etc. They was not aware of the nature of the experiment.
Lying in the vaults of an archive in modern-day Namibia, Eugen Fischer's original files and photographs remain as he left them a century ago. They reveal his methods and also his aims.
Here Eugen Fischer has lined the different pictures up next to each other to try to trace very specific facial features like the eyes or the noses. And the reason he's done this is to try to show how very specific African facial features like high cheekbones and the drawn-out eyes that represent the African genes are very prominent and become more prominent through the generations. Eugen Fischer came to Namibia to prove one basic point, and that was that racial mixing was always bad, and that the African gene is dominant over the white gene.
Fischer's work in Rehoboth sealed his reputation as one of Germany's leading racial scientists. It also brought him recognition from a nation that was then experiencing the greatest influx of immigration the world had ever seen. In the first years of the 20th century, the ethnic makeup of America was being transformed as millions of immigrants poured into her great cities. Many of those who feared that mass immigration would lead to widespread racial mixing looked to the ideas of eugenics, an increasingly powerful science.
Eugenics flourished, mutated, and went out of control when it got to the United States. And the irony is that the eugenics movement in the United States, which certainly descended directly from Galton, had the great advantage of having a lot of money, a huge amount of money.
Some of that money was used to establish the Eugenics Records Office, ran by the infamous Charles Davenport. In order to defend the health and purity of the white race, Davenport and his followers sought to identify those classes and those races in America whom they considered genetically unfit. Identified and monitored, the scientists would then take control of their lives and their fertility.
Once you were identified as a certain class, it meant what school you could go to, what cemetery you could be buried in, where you could live. It was a matter of life and death. Marriage laws were established in dozens of states around the United States, saying that people could not marry outside of their group. Blacks could not marry whites, Indians could not marry blacks. In Virginia, if you married the wrong person, meaning interracial marriage, They would unmarry you. They would invalidate your marriage.
27 states passed eugenics marriage laws, and the eugenicists spread their message using the new medium of cinema. The propaganda was intended to protect the genetic health of the white race. This would be achieved by eradicating those deemed unworthy through forced mass sterilization.
They went about methodically tracking ancestry and targeting bloodlines for extinction. That's eugenics, the effort to create a white, master, blonde, blue-eyed master race by wiping out other bloodlines until they were left only with themselves and people who resembled themselves. And what's important here is that these people thought they were saving humanity. These people thought they were liberals. They were reformers.
Eugenics was a worldwide movement. In Sweden, an official program forcibly sterilized 60,000 people, mental patients and members of the ethnic minorities. In Britain, the Eugenics Society received widespread support from across the political spectrum. But it was in Germany that the radical ideas of the American eugenics movement found its most receptive audience.
Anything connected to America would seem to be modern, progressive, scientific, democratic, reasonable, so it must be good. America was the future, the force of the future. Secondly, I think that many European eugenicists, including the Germans, like the tone adopted by American eugenicists, which was very radical and sort of no-nonsense, and they didn't use euphemisms. They said exactly what they meant.
The Americans provided more than just inspiration. American foundations also bankrolled the development of German eugenics. This was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology and Human Heredity. In the 1930s, the men and women who worked here received grants from the American Rockefeller Foundation. And the leading scientist here was the man who made his name in Namibia, Eugen Fischer. Under the Nazis, Fischer was empowered to sterilize the racially mixed people of Germany's Rhineland, 400 of them, all children. The majority of those sterilized by the Nazis before 1939, however, were the mentally ill. But when the Nazis began their war, they abandoned sterilization in favor of adult euthanasia, the Nazi euphemism for murder. The victims of this program were amongst the first people gassed by the Nazis, but the program wasn't restricted to the mentally ill.
When they have killed the target figure of mental patients they want to kill, which is roughly 70,000 people, they slightly exceeded it. So the first thing they do then is to contact the SS, who have large numbers of what they deem to be sick concentration camp prisoners. In other words, people who might have wear glasses or be myopic or have a wooden leg or something. So they want them out of the way. So these people oblige and they take 15 or 20,000 people from the concentration camps and kill them on behalf of the SS. It's a bit like sort of contract work. And then when the SS and other people have decided they're going to go for the big project, which is to kill the Jewish population of Europe, and in particular that of Poland, which is the biggest population they're concerned with, then those people push themselves forward and say, well, hey, we can do this, we've done it, we have a record of doing this, we murder people, and they become the core personnel in all the big extermination camps.
These killing centres were the second network of concentration camps and death camps in German history. And the experts in eugenics, or race hygiene as the Germans called it, were involved not just in their day-to-day running, but also in the highest levels of planning.
It's worth reminding ourselves that the Wannsee Conference, which was the one that set up the plan for the final solution, almost half the people around that table had doctorates, PhDs, in race hygiene, or genetics, as we'd say today. So there really is a genuine link between the Galtonian agenda and the horrors which happened in Germany.
The German experts in race hygiene who assembled here at the Wannsee Villa outside Berlin dreamed of racial genocide, just like their spiritual predecessors, the race scientists and the social Darwinists of the Age of Empire. But the colonial genocides, inspired and justified by the 19th century theorists, have been written out of Europe's history. The horrors of the Shark Island death camp, the destruction of the Tasmanian Aboriginals, the 30 million victims of the Indian famines, all have been forgotten. The erasure of this memory encourages the belief that Nazi violence was an aberration in European history. Though the Holocaust itself was motivated by the fanatical anti-Semitism of the Nazis, it can also be seen as part of a longer historical continuum, one that identifies it as a logical extension of scientific racism. But this history, like the bones in the Namibian deserts, refuses to remain buried forever.
China adopted the dreaded one-child policy due to lobbying from a consortium of eugenics organizations, which includes Planned Parenthood and the United Nations. Couples that have more than one child face heavy fines and imprisonment. The practice of forced abortion in China, coupled with the cultural desire to have a male child, has plunged China into a deepening crisis where there are 30 million more men than women. The Chinese police state ruthlessly crushes all forms of dissent. Underground churches, Falun Gong practitioners, striking factory workers are all sent to forced labor camps. Their blood and tissue types are cataloged in preparation for organ harvesting. The Chinese government then sells the prisoners' organs to the highest bidder on the world market. If a wealthy patient chooses to fly into China, the prisoner is killed and the organs are implanted. If the organs are being flown out of the country, a mobile execution van extracts the organs on the way to the waiting aircraft. The social engineers of China aggressively euthanize the elderly and disabled. China is merely following the globalist blueprint for the world, The same system of total dehumanization is quietly being phased in worldwide.
Приобретена эта победа. Не забывайте принесенных вами жертв.
You must teach people to love their leader. This is the only most important.
Why don't we learn from the mistakes of our ancestors? Why does humankind find itself bound in a cycle of bloodshed and enslavement? Predatory elites have always rationalized their oppression by claiming that they are superior and have the divine right to rule, when all they really are is a gaggle of ruthless psychopaths, parasitically feeding on the host population until their cancerous movement causes the collapse of the host. There have been thousands of tyrannical governments in history, and less than 10 that can truly be called free. In the 20th century alone, over 150 million people were murdered at the hands of the state. In Russia, the Red Terror consumed the lives of more than 60 million men, women, and children. Hitler's war killed 22 million. During Mao Zedong's reign alone, more than 60 million peasant farmers were killed. And the list goes on. 300,000 innocent civilians killed in Guatemala. More than 2 million souls brutally murdered by the government of Cambodia. 1,500,000 killed in Turkey. 300,000 in Uganda. 800,000 plus hacked to death with machetes in Rwanda. Sadly, there are too many examples of innocent families being exterminated by their governments on an industrial scale to name them all. It is a historical fact that the state is the #1 cause of unnatural death. If you take the 150 million people killed by power-mad government in the last century and divide it by 100,000, the number of souls lost would fill the biggest sports stadium, packed with 100,000 screaming fans, 1,500 times over. That's 1,500 sports stadiums, crammed with 100,000 people each, all exterminated. For those who think it can't happen here or won't happen to them, you have been warned. The carnage witnessed in the last 100 years was only the preparatory phase of the New World Order's master plan.
少有常识的人都会看出，如果我们的铁骑继续前进，这个螳臂挡车的歹徒难道能够阻挡得了吗？
Hitler and Stalin's crimes are now part of history. But the communist Chinese system of evil is not content with racking up the highest death toll in history. The mass murder and enslavement is still going on today and enjoys the full support and sanction of the New World Order.
摄像机拍下的这个画面，同西方某些国家的宣传恰恰相反，正好说明了我们的军队。
Communist China serves as a globalist laboratory, a proving ground where 1.4 billion people live out their lives as guinea pigs who serve as test subjects for the formulation of the brave new world. U.S. and British forces worked closely with Mao Zedong during World War II, and at the end of the war, they secretly backed Mao in driving out Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist. The OSS, and then the CIA, believed that Mao would have a stabilizing effect. Bill Clinton's mentor and Georgetown University political science professor Carol Quigley explained in his book, Tragedy and Hope, while the Anglo-American Roundtable groups backed every brand of authoritarianism, from communism to fascism, to ensure that a centralized government dominates the population and the economy as planned. The elite are monopoly men. They seek to create monopolies and dominate populations through the barrel of a gun. In their writings, the leadership of the New World Order has continuously heaped praise on the corrupt Communist Chinese model. In August of 1973, in an article written by David Rockefeller for the New York Times, Rockefeller openly lauds and endorses Mao Zedong's actions, while celebrating their command and control system.
Whatever the price of the Chinese Revolution, it has obviously succeeded not only in producing more efficient and dedicated administration, but also in fostering high morale and community of purpose. The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in history. David Rockefeller, New York Times, August 10, 1973.
Communist China is the model planned society for the New World Order. China has received more United Nations awards for its policies and form of governance than any other nation. In the eyes of globalist planners, authoritarian China is the future.